question for the 70s. Can man survive? Here's one answer from Rand Corporation consultant Dr. A.G. Wilson.
If our basic question is, can man survive? My approach to this would be to look at the processes that go on in nature. Nature attempts to assure survival of life through the creation of many varieties of organisms. I think the same thing can be applied to men and human culture. That as conditions change, whether these conditions are economic or the results of our impact on the environment, our chances of survival are increased through having many approaches, through variety. It's the old saying of, let's not have all the eggs in one basket.
But in ways that some scientists feel are filled with danger to mankind, we're putting a lot of our food, not just eggs, in what could be a very fragile basket. The Land and Man was produced by Walter McGraw for Group W, Westinghouse Broadcasting Company, with Dr. Harry Shapiro of the American Museum of Natural History as consultant. I'm Garry Moore. You know, it's become sort of a knee-jerk reaction to expect anyone who is talking about our environment to be filled with gloom and dire predictions. But there's one area that's different. When you talk about the soil as differentiated from the land, you can find some pretty cheerful people. One of these is the Deputy Administrator for Soil Conservation of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Dr. Charles E. Kellogg.
I was called up to testify in the Congress. The chairman of the committee was lecturing me on soil conservation. Finally, I interrupted him a moment and I said, Mr. Chairman, I don't know exactly what you mean by soil conservation. You mean keeping the soils of Florida as productive as they were when the Indians had them? Well, he says, I never put it that way. Yes, that's my point of view. I said, how many farm families do you think you and your colleagues would be representing in this Congress if that's all we were able to do? He said, well, I don't know. How many do you think? I know not more than 12, and I doubt if there'd be 6. Soils today are infinitely more productive than they ever were when the Indians had them. And we searched the world for germplasm. We learned the nutrient deficiencies of these soils and learned to control the water table in these sandy soils. Now, we've had the United States, particularly in the southern Great Plains, in fact, in all the Great Plains. The kind of farming had only a little to do with this. The greatest dust storm on record that I know about was recorded by our Puritan ancestors in New England very shortly after they came here, when there wasn't a plow 10 miles west of the Atlantic Ocean. These areas are subject to enormous periods of drought. And I lived in North Dakota during the middle of that. For about 9 years, there were hot winds and far inadequate rainfall almost every summer. No summer with a normal crop for a period of 10 or 12 years. Well, the thing blows. The thing blows. It didn't blow as bad as it did earlier, but it does blow. So we don't want to confuse these things with natural phenomena. Erosion is a natural process. Most of our coastal plains, most of our deltas, a lot of our beautiful farmland on the terraces next to streams were deposited by running water in other periods, particularly the periods when the rainfall was very high after the end of the Ice Age. Then to jump now to our home country, when our people first came here, these soils were very poor all along the eastern part of the United States for food crops. They brought their seeds with them. Their yields were terribly low. I've looked at the records. But the Indians taught them to put a fish in the hill. Now, the Indians did that to appease the gods, but it was a good practice because it gave a fertilizer to the corn. The productivity of the soils of the world are just so much greater than they ever were before. But the thing is more precarious. When you breed maize, corn, or wheat, or any of these plants for high yield, high protein content, and all of this, you're narrowing the germplasm. And if a new disease or insect comes along, they're extraordinarily subject to it. I like to put it from Alice in Wonderland, one of the wildest books I know. The Queen has Alice by the hand, and they're running very fast. And Alice gets out of breath and wants to sit down. The Queen says, all right. She looks around, and, well, this is where we started. And the Queen said, well, what do you expect? Well, my country, if you run very fast, you get somewhere else. Oh, but the Queen says, here, it takes a lot of running to stay in the same place. And if you want to get somewhere else, you must reach twice as fast. Now, that's the story, sir, of American agriculture. People don't realize that. I've often pointed this out. If every single American left the United States and didn't anyone come back for 100 years, we would find practically none of our normal cultivated plants and domestic animals. They can't stand weeds. They can't stand competition. The plants that we grow have much higher and more particular demands for plant nutrients from the soil. They must be protected from competition. They're not like wild plants. They're much more tender. And so it takes a lot of watching. You see, the principle in farming is what I call the principle of interactions. Every single acre in the world that has a good harvest has four things about it, each in relation to one another. It has a balanced supply of nutrients. It has water and oxygen for the plant roots when they need them. It has a kind and variety of crop with the genetic ability to respond to ideal water and nutrients. And it has, fourthly, a system of protection against diseases and weeds and insects. Any farmer that leaves out any one of those is going to fail. If you're going to have expensive irrigation water, that's fine. If you do everything else right, you'll make some money. But if you spend a lot on irrigation, don't fertilize properly, don't get the right variety, you won't make any money. This is a thing that the old farmers of several hundred years ago knew intuitively. I've been with illiterate African natives in the mountains, 300 miles from where you could buy fertilizer, but they understood this principle. But it's been worked out now through research. You've got to do these things together. And frankly, sir, we haven't seen anything in the application of scientific agriculture.
But we have seen a lot. Here in the U.S., we've seen the post-World War II agricultural revolution with its new mechanized single-crop farms. We still see 49% of our country classified as farmland, while only 5% of our people live on it. 80% of our people live on only 10% of our land. Our land use, or more accurately, land misuse, is of great concern to the President's Council on Environmental Quality, as producer Walter McGraw discovered when he talked to one of its three members, Dr. Gordon McDonald.
We'd assess this as being the problem deserving of the highest priority. We've misused our land. We have not used our land wisely, nor have we developed institutional base by which we could use the land in a much happier fashion. One needs to point to the fact that the land use is generally in the hands of the local level of government, yet what happens in one jurisdiction or one municipality can have a great effect on what happens in neighboring municipalities. We must begin to look at land use in terms of regional, state, and national terms. The federal government has influenced the use of land in many ways. Some ways these have been progressive in the sense that we have preserved national parks, wilderness areas. But in many other ways, the federal government has contributed to the degradation of the land. I can just point to, let's say, the developments around Cape Kennedy, where federal funding led to a rapid growth to a very tawdry community, and now we're faced with a cutback in space funds. What is going to happen in this county when farm subsidy with regard to urban areas. All of these have influenced land use, and not always to the best interest of the country as a whole.
We're told that in, I believe it's the majority of our counties, the population is falling, and yet we have this horrendous crowding along the corridors. Can the government do anything about that?
Well, this is, again, a key question that is closely tied to land use. It's not only our total numbers that is significant in terms of the environment, but where these numbers live. I believe the government has followed policies that have tended to encourage the movement to the urban regions. We spend a great deal today in supporting various urban programs. We have developed a system that provides for high mobility for the population. We have tended to discourage small farm holdings. Thus, I see a large number of programs that have been pursued in such a way that they have led to a migration from the countryside into the city and into the suburbs. The suburbs are the regions that are growing at the fastest rate at present. And again, I'd say this growth is taking place without due consideration for the use of the land, the provision of open spaces, the provision of diversity, all of which are necessary if we are to have a high quality of life in this country.
Have we passed the point of no return as far as remedying this?
If we decide that this is the problem and give it the priority that we think it should, there are opportunities. For example, our tax laws tend to favor rapid depreciation of property. They, to some extent, tend to favor the land speculator, the real estate speculator. The whole question of tax incentives and how they can be used to bring about a better use of land is an area where I think a great deal can be done. We can start also encouraging through a number of ways better land use planning at the county municipal level, so that the planning goes together with planning in surrounding regions.
And this is a problem that's becoming less and less uniquely American. It's becoming a typical world problem, especially in the developing countries. Man depends on land for living room and for food. He has only so much land. The planet is finite. Man's ability to increase his numbers seems infinite, which is a matter of great concern to Lester R. Brown of the Overseas Development Council.
I participated in a symposium sponsored by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, in which 24 people focused on the question, what is an optimum level of population? And of this group, a majority concluded that the world had already passed the optimum level. That is, we had too many people already. If one looks at population growth and the rate at which it has grown historically, it took us nearly 2 million years to reach the first billion people. The current billion being added will take only 15 years, from 1960 to 1975. That's the fourth billion. By this time, the next century, if we continue to increase at the current rate of 2% per year, we'll be adding 1 billion every year. Clearly, something has to give, and I think fairly soon, where population growth is concerned. I suspect we'll have to formulate a new ethic, a survival ethic, if you will. And an important component of that ethic will be that no couple have more than 2 children. And this is in contrast with the situation in which man has found himself throughout most of his existence, when survival depended on having large numbers of children because of high death rates and risk from disease and predatory animals and so forth. Man survived only because he was able to have large numbers of children. But now we find ourselves with this situation entirely reversed as growth in human populations and economic activity puts more and more pressure on what we now recognize as a very finite ecosystem. If we don't limit population and let it continue to grow at the current rate of, say, 2% per year on a the end of the century, we will need to at least double food production in order to feed this number of people. In order to double food production, we would have to greatly intensify food production on land already under cultivation. The reason for this is that there are not many areas in the world where there are sizable areas of fertile land to be brought under the plow. Stated otherwise, most of the good land is already in cultivation. And in order to intensify production, to get a doubling of food production between now and the end of the century, we would have to use many more agricultural chemicals than we are now using. Much more fertilizer, much more pesticides, probably tripling or even quadrupling the use of these chemicals.
Lester Brown wrote a book, The Seeds of Change. He was assisted on that project by Robert Shaw.
We need to know a great deal more about the ecological consequences of increased food production. At the present time, the total usage of fertilizers in developing countries is a staggeringly small 10% or something of U.S. total usage. There's obviously a great deal of room for increase before one starts having a massive effect on the ecological balance. At the same time, the use of pesticides by people who don't know very much about their effects can be very dangerous in the short run. Very recently, 80 people in Nicaragua died through deodorant poisoning. I think that, at least in the foreseeable future, the most difficult ecological problems are going to come about as a result of an increase in the amount of irrigation required. Dams present huge problems for erosion, for silting, for disease spreading, the effect of which we know very little about at present, and we certainly know very little about how to control them. This is not to say that we shouldn't try to increase food production, but that we should try to learn far more about the ecological consequences of what we're doing and to control these ecological consequences much more effectively than we have been able to in the past.
To some environmentalists, those problems seem insuperable. One of these is Dr. Paul Ehrlich, author of The Population Bomb.
There is just no chance of continuing to increase food production by something like 3% a year in perpetuity, which is what would be necessary to take care of the population that we expect by the year 2000 at a better level than it's being taken care of today. You have to increase agricultural production by 2% a year every year just to keep today's level of starvation going. Right now we're losing 10 to 20 million people annually to starvation. The equivalent in the year 2000 would be losing 20 to 40 million people a year to starvation. If we are to maintain that level of starvation, we must increase our food production by 2% a year. Now, in 1969, we didn't increase it by anything. There's every sign that most years we will not be able to increase it by anything or make small gains, and this means that the gap between food and population is going to grow inevitably. If we should last to the year 2000, of course, we then face the problem of increasing the food production for 2% a year in perpetuity, because even if we had a population control miracle today, and everybody in the world decided that they were going to have, say, between 2 and 3 children, absolute maximum, the world population would still grow until almost the middle of the next century. So in other words, there is no such thing as a panacea at the food end. It just won't work.
But a Nobel Peace Prize was given to a man for being the father of what is called the Green Revolution, which many feel will solve all of our food problems. Incidentally, the prize winner, Dr. Norman Borlaug, said he did not feel that way. And neither does Lester Brown.
The term Green Revolution is a shorthand expression describing the rapid spread of high-yielding wheats and rices in the poor countries. These wheats were developed in Mexico and the rices in the Philippines at the International Rice Research Institute. These varieties, with sufficient water and fertilizer and proper management, are capable of easily doubling yields of traditional varieties in many of the developing countries. Both India and Pakistan have increased their wheat production more than 50% over the past 4 years. Now, wheat is a sub-staple in both of these countries, but this increase has nonetheless greatly increased the food supply. Increases in wheat yields in both India and Pakistan following the introduction of these high-yielding wheats were far greater than those which occurred in the United States with corn following the introduction of hybrid corn nearly a generation ago. You see Mexico increasing its per capita food supply nearly 40% in a 10-year period. We see Ceylon and Malaysia increasing their rice supply nearly 10% per year over the past 2 years. We see the Philippines, using the new rices, becoming self-sufficient and a rice exporter for the first time in half a century.
To which Dr. Ehrlich adds,
there have been some increases in production of rice and wheat in the world. You, however, have to look very closely at what's going on. For instance, I can show you what happened in a nation which this year announced very proudly that it was now rice self-sufficient. Well, what does this mean? Does this mean that everybody, that's the Philippines, does everybody in the Philippines have enough rice to eat? Well, actually, in 1968, at a World Conference on Freedom from Hunger, I heard a Filipino official brag that with the new rices, the Philippines would be rice self-sufficient by 1970. And he then indicated a young Filipino farmer that he brought with him and said, and this means that Jose here can have, his beautiful wife can have as many babies as she wants. Right after that, Philippine government put a very high price support under rice, lower price supports under corn, and basically priced rice out of the diets of many Filipinos. As a result, a very large surplus of rice was created in the Philippines because the people had to eat corn. With a low-grade rice, there's a lot of problems with the so-called IR-8 rices and their successors. They're not very good to eat and so on. And this year, the Filipinos had to dump on the world market at way below their support price surplus rice, which they then bragged made them rice self-sufficient. Well, of course, any country can be self-sufficient simply by ceasing imports and starting exports of a substance, but that doesn't mean that people are eating better. In fact, the whole problem of world food surpluses are surpluses created with mirrors. These are economic surpluses. It doesn't mean that hungry people are being fed. It means that for some reason there is more food around than people have the money to buy. And, of course, hungry people don't usually generate demand. So that fundamentally, almost all the stuff about food surpluses is utter nonsense. It's just basically lying to the public.
While Lester Brown called his book The Seeds of Change, Time magazine wrote of The Seeds of Revolution, which could be a more accurate title. In the developing countries, just as it happened here, fewer people are needed on the new, highly mechanized Green Revolution farms. So, more and more unemployed and unemployable farm laborers are streaming into the already overcrowded cities, where often food prices are going up, not down. Again, Lester Brown.
One of the second-generation problems of the Green Revolution is the marketing and distribution problem. We're finding that in areas such as northern India, where a farmer once marketed perhaps 1/5 of his crop, retaining the other 4/5 for home use, that when he doubles his crop, his marketable surplus goes up 6-fold. With this sort of increase in the amount of food to be marketed, the stresses on the traditional outmoded marketing system, transportation, storage, and so forth, are very considerable. One could cite many other second-generation problems in addition to marketing. One is the distribution of the benefits. Those farmers who have adequate water supplies, usually in the form of irrigation, can use the new seed. Those who do not have often cannot profitably use them. And so we find some farmers doubling or tripling their income almost overnight, while the neighbors down the road or in the adjoining state are still trapped with traditional cultivating practices. So we see some serious political stresses developing within a number of countries, India, Pakistan, Mexico, to name a few.
As more and more small farmers lose their land to the few big farmers who can afford to grow the super grains, more and more land is given over to what is called monoculture. Vast areas support only one crop. As we heard earlier, this can be dangerous. There is safety in variety. Nature seems to abhor not only vacuums, but monotony. U.S. corn farmers have found that out with the sudden emergence of a super blight on their super hybrid corn. So, couldn't the super rices and super wheats also fall victim to super pests of one sort or another?
This is clearly a risk the further we get from nature, the more advanced our agriculture becomes, the more vulnerable it becomes in many ways, even given our advanced technologies for controlling various pests, including both insects and diseases. It's interesting to look at this problem in historical terms. The potato was introduced into northwestern Europe from the New World sometime after Columbus established the link between the Old and the New World. And the potato did very well in the climate and in the soils of northwestern Europe. It did particularly well in Ireland, well enough that the population of Ireland began to grow quite rapidly and did so for several decades. And then in 1847, a potato blight struck in Ireland. And as a result, a large part of the potato crop was entirely destroyed. The net effect of this was famine. And in the period of 2 or 3 years, 1.5 million Irishmen died of famine. Another 2 or 3 million migrated. And for nearly a century, Ireland had a negative rate of population growth. Its population today is scarcely 4 million, hardly half of the 8 million that lived in Ireland before the potato blight struck. This, it seems to me, does have some lessons. It does indicate how vulnerable we become. There is a possibility that countries introducing these new seeds and spreading them very rapidly in the countryside could experience a similar problem. We have little choice other than to make the effort, however, since population growth requires it. It's a risk, a real risk, but a necessary risk, simply because we don't have that many alternatives given the population pressure that is building. But there are a number of very encouraging signs where the Green Revolution is concerned. It clearly is postponing the threat of famine which loomed so imminent, particularly in Asia just a few years ago. It may be buying another 10 or perhaps 15 years with which to slow down and stabilize population growth. If, however, 15 years hence, population growth in the developing countries is still growing rapidly, then I think we'll probably be back where we were before the Green Revolution began.
And scientists point out one other factor. The Green Revolution was brought about by increasing nutrients to plants whose genes had been changed. But there are limits to the amount of nutrients you can add to a plant, and there are limits to the changes you can make in genes. Scientists now feel that we've reached the point where feeding more nutrients or changing more genes will never again increase those plants' productivity. We've made them as efficient as they're ever going to be. In summary, Dr. Paul Ehrlich.
The Green Revolution is a good idea. In other words, if you want to increase the world's food supply, the smartest way to try and do it is to try and increase yields on land under cultivation, not trying to bring marginal land under cultivation, not trying to introduce brand new crops, but trying to get higher yields with the crops that you have. But for a whole complex of reasons, this is extremely difficult. Progress is inevitably going to be slow, and all kinds of disasters are going to occur to slow it up. And even if you have the maximum success suggested for the Green Revolution by the most optimistic and uninformed people, that is, that it will keep food production up with population growth for 20 or 30 years, you know immediately that means disaster, because population growth is going to go on for an absolute minimum of 60 or 70 years unless we have an enormous rise in the death rate. And of course, what everybody who's knowledgeable believes is we are going to have an enormous rise in the death rate.
Dr. Ehrlich is on the advisory council of an organization called Friends of the Earth. Now, if you're interested in what you can do to be a friend of our Earth and perhaps help avoid that enormous increase in the death rate, you can write to Friends of the Earth, FOE, 451 Pacific Avenue, San Francisco, California. The zip code is 94133. I'll repeat that address. You can write to Friends of the Earth, FOE, 451 Pacific Avenue, San Francisco, California, and again the zip is 94133. More about our Earth in our next report on Water and Man, produced by Group W, Westinghouse Broadcasting Company, with Dr. Harry Shapiro of the American Museum of Natural History as consultant. Can Man Survive is written and produced by Walter McGraw. Bill Kaland is the executive producer. I'm Garry Moore.
let all